My name is Maya, and from the moment I could decipher the elegant looping script in my grandmother's cherished first editions, the whispering dust motes dancing in slanted sunbeams, and the shadowed mysterious corners of Blackwood Manor, our family's sprawling, melancholic, and rapidly decaying ancestral estate were not just my playground, but my most cherished, intimate companions. At 27, armed with a hard-won degree in history with a specialization in archival studies and a quiet, burning passion for uncovering the silent, often deliberately obscured stories held captive within its crumbling, ivy-clad limestone walls, I wasn't just the quirky, bookish niece who preferred the company of ghosts and old things. I was in my own determined way a budding historian, a fledgling detective of the past, wholly dedicated to the monumental task of piecing together Blackwood's fragmented soul. My most fervent, all-consuming dream was to see Blackwood meticulously, lovingly restored, not merely as a private, inaccessible relic for our increasingly disinterested extended family, but as a vibrant, engaging historical site, a dynamic center for learning research and genuine community engagement, its true complex and long-forgotten narratives finally respectfully shared with the world. But I never ever in my most fearful, anxious imaginings fathomed that the greatest, most insidious threat to Blackwood's continued survival and to the invaluable, potentially paradigm-shifting history I was on the very precipice of unearthing would come not from the relentless, indifferent ravages of time, the slow creep of decay, or even the perennial lack of essential restoration funds, but from deep within the supposedly hallowed protective circle of my own family. Specifically from my pragmatic, ruthlessly financially driven, and utterly chillingly unsentimental older uncle Richard Blackwood, the current undisputed executor of the estate. The memory of his smooth, dismissive arrogance, his casual, almost gleeful prioritization of cold hard profit over priceless, irreplaceable heritage still ignites a cold, righteous, and fiercely determined fire within the very core of my being. Before I share with you the incredible, almost unbelievable story of the lost hidden history I quite literally stumbled upon within Blackwood's most neglected, forgotten recesses, a story that had the power to reshape our understanding of local and even national events. Before I detail how my own uncle, a man I had once, however distantly respected, callously, deliberately, tried to bulldoze that precious history, literally and figuratively, for the sake of a quick, lucrative, and soulless property deal, and before I recount the desperate, breathless race against time that led to a dramatic, very public reckoning that left him and his equally greedy associates visibly ashen-faced and utterly disgraced, I'd be so incredibly grateful if you'd let me know where you're connecting with me from today in the comments section below. And please, I earnestly implore you, do hit that like button if you've ever felt that profound, almost spiritual, passionately compelling urge to protect something truly precious, beautiful, and irreplaceable from the encroaching destructive clutches of cynical greed or blank unthinking indifference. Chapter 1. The Hidden Past. A greedy present and the battle for Blackwood's soul begins. Blackwood Manor wasn't just an old rambling house to me, a mere collection of bricks and mortar, timber and slate. It was a living, breathing archive, a silent stone and timber sentinel that had patiently, stoically witnessed centuries of our town's, and by extension, our nation's complex unfolding drama, its very air thick with the scent of beeswax, old parchment wood smoke, and something indefinably ancient and melancholic, thrummed with a symphony of untold stories of lives lived within its walls. Joys, sorrows, triumphs, and tragedies. I'd spent countless idyllic childhood summers and later more focused, research-driven university holidays exploring its labyrinthine, echoing corridors, its cobweb-draped, treasure-filled attics, its vast, chillingly damp cellars, and its overgrown, tragically romantic gardens, where statues of forgotten graces peeked shyly from beneath tangled webs of ivy. I always sensed, with an almost visceral certainty, that there was infinitely more to Blackwood than the officially recorded, rather pedestrian and frankly somewhat sanitized family history that everyone in our lineage passively, unquestioningly accepted. My historian's intuition, that persistent, nagging inner voice screamed at me with increasing urgency that profound, deliberately buried secrets lay dormant, waiting within its ancient, weary heart. And then one sweltering, impossibly humid July afternoon, a day when the very air seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities, deep within the disused, long-locked-away former governess's wing, a forgotten, forlorn section of the sprawling manor that Uncle Richard had always contemptuously dismissed as structurally unsound, dangerously dilapidated, and full of nothing more interesting than rat droppings and dry rot. I found it. My heart was already pounding from the illicit thrill of having picked the rusty old lock, a skill gleaned from a surprisingly informative online forum, the air in the wing thick with the undisturbed dust of decades smelling of decay and forgotten lives. Tucked away beneath a surprisingly loose warped floorboard, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten disintegrating velvet curtains, and carefully lovingly wrapped in a thick layer of oilskin, then tied with a fragile, faded, once lavish velvet ribbon, was a small, remarkably well-preserved collection of exquisitely penned letters and a sturdy, leather-bound clasped diary. They belonged, I discovered with a jolt that shot up my spine, to a woman named Ilara Vance, a previously unknown, unmentioned, and clearly significant distant ancestor, whose very existence, it soon became terrifyingly apparent, had been deliberately, systematically, and quite thoroughly erased from all official family records and genealogies. As I carefully, reverently, with trembling fingers, unfurled the brittle, age-browned pages of the first letter, a breathtaking, almost unbelievable forgotten chapter of not just Blackwood's, but our nation's history began to unfurl with them. Ilara's elegant, impassioned, and often surprisingly witty writings, penned in a fine, spidery copperplate script, detailed her secret, extraordinarily courageous and highly dangerous involvement in a pivotal yet largely undocumented and misunderstood local uprising during a crucial, turbulent period of national political conflict and social upheaval in the mid-19th century. She had, it transpired, used Blackwood Manor itself, its hidden passages, its secret rooms, some of which even I had never discovered, its vast, concealing grounds. As a clandestine vital hub for a network of radical dissidents, a crucial safe house for fugitives, a secret printing press for seditious pamphlets, and a covert communication nexus for a movement that history had largely and unjustly painted as villainous or insignificant, her vivid, articulate words painted an electrifying, deeply moving picture of astounding bravery, intricate political intrigue, heart-stopping close calls, profound personal sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to ideals of justice and equality that were centuries ahead of her time. This discovery, I knew instantly with every fiber of my being, was monumental. It had the power to completely rewrite local history, to challenge long-held national narratives, and crucially, for my beloved Blackwood, it positioned the manor not just as a grand decaying family home, but as a site of profound, undeniable national historical significance, far exceeding anything previously imagined or recorded. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I continued to read, tears blurring Ilara's precious words. This discovery would qualify Blackwood for the highest level of national heritage status, ensuring not only its permanent protection from demolition, but also access to the substantial public and private funding required for its meticulous, historically accurate restoration. My long-held, deeply cherished dream of preserving and sharing Blackwood's myriad stories suddenly had a powerful, undeniable, almost sacred focus. Ilara Vance had entrusted her story to the future, and I was now its custodian. Brimming with an almost unbearable, intoxicating excitement, my mind already racing with detailed plans for scholarly articles, meticulously curated museum exhibits, immersive educational programs, and perhaps even a biography of the astonishing Ilara Vance, I immediately, if perhaps naively, sought out my Uncle Richard. He was, after all, the current executor of the Blackwood estate, the eldest surviving male of his generation, the one who held the casting vote, the ultimate legal authority, on its increasingly precarious, uncertain future. I found him in his sleek, minimalist, and aggressively modern city office, a sterile glass and chrome box that could not have been more different from the organic, time-worn embrace of Blackwood. He listened to my breathless, passionate, and perhaps slightly incoherent account of Ilara Vance, her incredible game-changing story, and the profound implications for Blackwood with a carefully cultivated look of polite but rapidly visibly waning patience. His perfectly manicured fingers drummed a restless, impatient tattoo on the polished, reflective surface of his oversized mahogany desk. When I finally finished, my voice hoarse with emotion, my eyes shining with unshed tears of discovery and hope, he simply leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, a small, cool, almost pitying smile playing on his thin lips. "Maya, my dear," he said, his voice laced with that familiar, weary, utterly infuriating condescension he always reserved for what he termed my charming but ultimately pointless historical obsessions. "It's a truly charming little tale. Quite romantic, I'm sure, in a gothic sort of way. But hardly practical, is it, when all is said and done?" He then gestured dismissively with a flick of his wrist towards a large, glossy, and horrifyingly soulless architectural rendering spread across his wide credenza. A sterile, anonymous, and utterly depressing design for a sprawling complex of identical boxes titled Blackwood Pines Luxury Condominiums and Retail Experience. "This Maya," he announced, his voice now imbued with a sudden sharp businesslike enthusiasm, "is practical. This, my dear girl, is the future. I've just as of this morning, as a matter of fact, accepted a very, very generous indeed, quite unrefusable offer from Sterling Development. Mr. Alistair Sterling is a highly reputable, very successful developer, and he's prepared to pay absolute top dollar for the entire Blackwood land parcel. We can finally be rid of that crumbling, voracious money pit of a manor and realize its true substantial market value. It's a win-win for the entire family." My heart, which had been soaring with such elation just moments before, plummeted into an icy abyss. "But Uncle Richard," I stammered, the words catching in my throat, my hands clutching Ilara's precious diary as if it were a shield. "Ilara's letters, the diary, her story. This changes everything. Blackwood isn't just land to be sold off to the highest bidder. It's an irreplaceable historical treasure. We have to preserve it. We must share her incredible story with the world. It's our duty." He sighed, a long, theatrical put-upon display of exaggerated forbearance, as if dealing with a particularly trying, simple-minded child. "Maya, do try to be realistic for once in your life. Those old dusty papers you found are probably just some fanciful, exaggerated scribblings of a bored, lonely spinster with an overactive imagination. Unproven. Unverifiable, most likely, after all this time. And even if by some miracle there's a tiny grain of truth to this dramatic tale of yours, do you have any earthly idea what it would cost in real terms to restore Blackwood to any kind of acceptable heritage standard? Millions, Maya, millions we simply don't have, and frankly wouldn't be sensible to spend, even if we did. Sterling's offer is a godsend, a lifeline. It will secure everyone's financial future, provide a comfortable retirement for your parents and myself, and leave a tidy sum for your generation too, if you don't fritter it away on lost causes." He then informed me, his voice hardening into a tone that brooked no argument, that the sale to Sterling Development was already in its advanced stages, all due diligence, nearly complete contracts drawn up, and that my sudden, rather theatrical and deeply sentimental discovery was nothing more than an inconvenient, unwelcome, and frankly rather irritating last-minute complication that he didn't appreciate in the slightest. To add a final brutal insult to profound injury, he coolly, almost casually informed me that as part of Mr. Sterling's preliminary site survey and safety assessment for the proposed condo development, the entire governess's wing, Ilara's wing, was scheduled for immediate structural stabilization work. A chilling euphemism I instantly sickeningly suspected for extensive gutting or even partial strategically targeted demolition to remove any problematic historical features within the week. And he added his eyes like chips of ice. I was to hand over Ilara Vance's letters and diary to him immediately for safekeeping, proper cataloging, and thorough legal review by the estate's solicitors. He also casually, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that my informal, lifelong access to Blackwood Manor, the place I considered my spiritual home, my very soul place, was now effective immediately formally revoked to avoid any potential interference with Mr. Sterling's highly professional survey team and their tight schedule. I stumbled out of his sterile, airless office, feeling as though the solid floor had dropped out from beneath me, as if I were falling into a bottomless, dark chasm, Ilara's precious, fragile writings clutched tightly, desperately to my chest, a cold, heavy dread settling like a shroud in the pit of my stomach. My uncle wasn't just callously indifferent to Blackwood's unique, irreplaceable history. He seemed actively, almost viciously determined to erase it along with the astonishing Elara Vance for the sake of a quick, lucrative, and utterly soulless property deal. The battle for Blackwood's survival for its very soul, and for the enduring truth of its hidden past, had just with terrifying clarity begun. The days immediately following that chilling definitive confrontation with Uncle Richard were a torment of enforced inactivity, simmering frustration, helpless fury, and a gnawing, ever-present anxiety. Blackwood Manor, my sanctuary, my intellectual playground, my very soul place, was now effectively off-limits, its gates symbolically, if not yet literally, barred to me. Its precious, precarious fate hung like the sword of Damocles, suspended by the thinnest of threads, threatened daily by the encroaching shadow of Sterling Development's bulldozers and my uncle's insatiable, cold-blooded avarice. Elara Vance's courageous, vibrant voice, so astonishingly alive and resonant in her meticulously kept, beautifully penned diary and letters, felt like a deeply personal charge, a sacred, desperate plea from the shadowed corridors of the past, a responsibility I would not under any circumstances ignore or abandon. I knew with a historian's unwavering bone-deep certainty that her extraordinary story was genuine, its potential historical significance truly immense, capable of reshaping long-held narratives. But Uncle Richard, as executor, held all the immediate legal cards, all the temporal power, and Mr. Alistair Sterling, the predatory developer, was notorious throughout the region for his aggressive, often underhanded tactics, and his seemingly bottomless financial resources. My path forward seemed terrifyingly obscured by formidable obstacles. Heartbroken, yes, but also imbued with a new, almost ferocious determination forged in the crucible of that confrontation, I knew with absolute clarity that I couldn't fight this monumental battle alone. My first, most urgent call, made with trembling fingers from a public library payphone — I was already paranoid about my own phone being monitored — was to Dr. Eleanor Albright, my beloved, fiercely brilliant, and wonderfully eccentric semi-retired history professor from university. She was a formidable, nationally respected academic with a razor-sharp, analytical mind, an encyclopedic, almost photographic knowledge of local and national 19th century history, and a passionate, deeply ingrained intolerance for historical revisionism, intellectual laziness, or, worst of all, the deliberate destruction of heritage for profit. I poured out the whole sorry, infuriating tale: Elara's astonishing discovery, Blackwood's hidden significance, Uncle Richard's callous, dismissive plans, the imminent threat of Sterling's development, my voice cracking with a mixture of tears and outrage. She listened in utter uncharacteristic silence, her only interjections occasional sharp intakes of breath or a low, thoughtful hum. When I finally finished sputtering with indignation, she was quiet for a long moment. Then her voice, usually warm and full of scholarly amusement, crackled down the line with an icy, controlled fury that sent shivers down my spine. "Maya, my dear girl, this is not just outrageous. It is an act of profound cultural vandalism and affront to historical integrity," she exclaimed, her voice resonating with righteous power. "An unverified, potentially priceless manuscript collection of this extraordinary potential caliber, detailing a previously unknown aspect of a pivotal historical period. And he wants to confiscate it, to bury it before any proper scholarly assessment or archival preservation can be undertaken. Preposterous, utterly preposterous. This requires immediate, decisive, and very strategic action. We must act, Maya, and we must act with both speed and cunning." Her immediate, unwavering, unquestioning belief in me, in the authenticity and profound importance of my find, was like a healing balm to my bruised, battered spirit, a desperately needed infusion of strength and hope. Together, often working late into the silent, echoing hours of the night in Dr. Albright's wonderfully cluttered, book-lined Victorian study, a cozy, reassuring sanctuary surrounded by the comforting, familiar scent of old paper lemon tea and beeswax polish, we embarked on a clandestine, increasingly desperate mission. Our twin objectives were clear: first, to irrefutably validate Elara Vance's astonishing story and firmly establish Blackwood Manor's national historical significance, and second, simultaneously, to unearth anything we could about the true nature of Uncle Richard's suspiciously rushed and seemingly undervalued deal with the predatory Sterling Development. Dr. Albright, with her decades of meticulous research experience, her impeccable academic credentials, and her surprisingly extensive network of contacts within the often arcane worlds of archival research, genealogy, and historical preservation, knew exactly where to look, who to discreetly ask, and what subtle clues to pursue. We meticulously, painstakingly cross-referenced every name, every date, every alluded-to event mentioned in Ilara's vivid, compelling writings, with obscure, often uncatalogued town records, archived stacks of fragile local newspapers from the turbulent mid-19th century, some so brittle they threatened to crumble into dust at the slightest touch. Dusty, leather-bound church registries detailing births, marriages, and deaths, and long-forgotten handwritten family genealogies stored in the climate-controlled vaults of the county archives. It was like attempting to piece together a vast, complex, centuries-old mosaic with more than half the precious tiles missing, and many of those remaining deliberately obscured or misleading. We spent countless eye-straining hours squinting at flickering microfilm readers, patiently deciphering spidery, faded 19th-century copperplate handwriting, and tenaciously chasing down the faintest, most elusive of historical clues. We found Ilara's baptismal record confirming her birth and parentage within the Blackwood lineage, a detail suspiciously absent from the official family tree curated by Uncle Richard's branch of the family. We unearthed a series of cryptic coded advertisements placed in a short-lived local dissident newspaper that precisely matched the dates and secret phrases Ilara mentioned in her diary concerning her covert communication network. Most thrillingly, in the forgotten archives of a defunct local historical society, Dr. Albright, with a triumphant yelp, discovered another contemporary diary penned by a respected local Quaker woman, which contained several oblique but unmistakable references to the brave, resourceful Miss V at the old manor on the hill and her courageous efforts in these dark and troubled times. Slowly, painstakingly, piece by precious piece, a clearer, more detailed, and undeniably authentic picture of Ilara Vance's extraordinary life and her courageous clandestine activities at Blackwood Manor began to emerge from the obscuring mists of time. Each new corroborating piece of independently verifiable evidence, a forgotten land deed here, a cryptic marginal note in another contemporary document, there a faded daguerreotype that bore a striking resemblance to Ilara's self-description, sent fresh shivers of exhilarating excitement down our spines. Her story was not just real, it was, we were increasingly convinced, even more historically significant, more nationally pivotal than I had initially dared to hope, directly and inextricably implicating Blackwood Manor in critical national events that had previously been understood very differently, or often incompletely, by mainstream academic historians. While Dr. Albright, with her characteristic scholarly rigor, focused primarily on the historical verification of Ilara's narrative, I, fueled by a growing visceral sense of unease and a powerful intuitive distrust, began to dedicate my own research efforts to investigating the opaque business dealings of Mr. Alastair Sterling and his shadowy entity Sterling Development. What I quickly found, buried beneath layers of shell corporations and carefully constructed PR, was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Sterling, it turned out, had a well-documented, if cleverly obscured, and legally sanitized history of acquiring historically sensitive or community-valued properties across several states under ostensibly benign, even altruistic pretenses, often promising sensitive restoration or community-focused redevelopment. However, his consistent pattern was to then exploit obscure legal loopholes, allow the often vulnerable structures to fall into deliberate, accelerated disrepair, through calculated neglect, demolition by strategic neglect, as Dr. Albright termed it, with grim knowing accuracy, and then once the buildings were officially deemed structurally unsound and unsalvageable by compliant, often bribed local inspectors, push through aggressive, highly profitable, high-density redevelopment plans that bore no resemblance whatsoever to his initial reassuring promises. He was, I realized with a sickening lurch, a highly sophisticated, legally insulated vulture in a bespoke Savile Row suit. More disturbingly, as I delved deeper into Oakhaven's property records and recent planning applications, I discovered through a series of discreet, off-the-record inquiries with former contacts I'd made during a previous archival internship at the city planning office that the proposed sale price Uncle Richard had accepted for the vast Blackwood Manor estate seemed significantly, almost ludicrously below its current assessed market value, especially for such a large, unencumbered parcel of prime, undeveloped land so close to the town center. This glaring discrepancy led me to a chilling, unavoidable suspicion. Uncle Richard wasn't just being callously unsentimental and financially pragmatic. He was potentially being spectacularly defrauded himself by the wily Sterling, or an even more chilling and personally painful possibility, he was actively knowingly colluding with Sterling, receiving a suspiciously large, undisclosed kickback or a substantial hidden equity stake in the proposed luxury condo project in return for facilitating the cut-price sale, and ensuring no historical complications arose. The soft, mournful whispers I'd always heard from Blackwood's ancient time-worn walls were no longer just of past heroism and forgotten lives. They were now ominously, angrily mingled with the sordid, greedy schemes and betrayals of the present day. As our parallel investigations deepened, gathering momentum and unearthing increasingly damning evidence, Uncle Richard, perhaps sensing my continued, albeit covert activities, and growing alarmingly nervous about the potential exposure of his deal, began to significantly escalate his pressure tactics. I received a second, far more formal and icily worded letter from his high-powered city lawyer, this one explicitly reminding me of my complete lack of legal standing or familial authority concerning the management and disposal of the Blackwood estate, and sternly, unequivocally warning me against any further actions, direct or indirect, that could be construed as attempting to jeopardize delay or otherwise interfere with the legally binding and agreed-upon sale to Sterling Development. He even, with a cruelty that took my breath away, began a subtle but insidious campaign to discredit me within our wider family and even in local academic circles, artfully painting me as a naive, troublemaking fantasist who was emotionally overwrought, living in a dream world, and irresponsibly trying to scuttle a sensible financial deal that would greatly benefit the entire extended Blackwood family. The resulting isolation from certain branches of the family was painful, a fresh layer of hurt on an already raw wound. But Alara Vance's clear, courageous voice, her unwavering conviction echoing across the centuries from the fragile, precious pages of her diary, kept me going, strengthening my resolve. We were, I knew with a growing sense of panic, in a desperate, almost unwinnable race against time. The ominously termed structural stabilization work on the irreplaceable governess's wing, Alara's sanctuary, the very place where I had found her precious documents, was, according to a distraught, whispered tip-off from a former Blackwood groundsman still loyal to my grandmother's memory, scheduled to begin any day, perhaps even within hours. I lived in constant, sickening fear that any further historical secrets it held, or even the physical, tangible space that was so absolutely central to Alara's incredible story, would be ruthlessly, irrevocably obliterated forever by Sterling's bulldozers before we could intervene. One terrifying afternoon, acting on a desperate impulse, I tried to discreetly access the Blackwood grounds via an old, overgrown service path to see for myself if work had begun, only to be confronted by two burly, menacing security guards hired by Sterling, who curtly informed me I was trespassing on private property and threatened to call the police if I didn't leave immediately. The walls were closing in both literally and figuratively. The noose we sensed with a chilling certainty was tightening with terrifying speed. Uncle Richard, clearly infuriated by our continued defiance, and perhaps genuinely panicked by the potential unraveling of his lucrative deal with Ancestor Sterling, had visibly accelerated the timeline for the complete and irreversible sale of Blackwood Manor. The ominously termed structural stabilization work on the irreplaceable historic governess's wing, Alara Vance's sanctuary, the very womb where I had discovered her precious, revelatory documents, was, according to our increasingly distraught and fearful informant, the former Blackwood groundsman, now scheduled to commence with aggressive force in less than 72 short hours. We were perilously out of time for quiet, methodical, behind-the-scenes research. We needed to act decisively, strategically, and with a courage neither Dr. Albright nor I entirely felt, but were determined to project. We needed to go public to bring the full weight of informed opinion and regulatory power to bear before it was too late. Dr. Albright and I, our evidence now meticulously compiled, cross-referenced, and triple-checked into an irrefutable, almost unassailable dossier. detailing not only the profound, game-changing historical significance of Alara Vance's writings, and by extension Blackwood Manor itself, but also the deeply suspicious, potentially fraudulent nature of the rushed Sterling deal and Uncle Richard's clear, demonstrable conflict of interest, made a crucial, nerve-wracking strategic decision. Instead of directly, futilely confronting my uncle again, a tactic we knew would be met with blustering denial and further legal threats, we decided to simultaneously take our explosive case to two powerful, independent, and we hoped unassailable bodies. Firstly, the State Historical Preservation Office SHPO, armed with a formally drafted legally sound emergency petition, co-signed by several other respected academics. Dr. Albright had rallied to immediately halt any and all work on the Blackwood Manor site, pending a full independent archaeological and historical significance assessment. And secondly, to a renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at a highly respected national newspaper, a man named Michael Davies, legendary for his fearless, deeply researched exposés on corporate corruption, political malfeasance, and the wanton destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage. We worked through a frantic, caffeine-fueled, almost surreal 24-hour period of non-stop activity, preparing multiple detailed summaries, painstakingly authenticating and redacting sensitive sections of Alara's documents for public consumption and drafting compelling, urgent cover letters outlining the stakes. My hands shook as I sealed the courier envelopes. This felt like our last desperate throw of the dice. The response when it came was swifter, more decisive, and infinitely more impactful than either of us had dared to realistically hope in our most optimistic imaginings. Michael Davies, the journalist, his reputation for sniffing out significant untold stories preceding him, responded within hours of receiving our package. He was, as Dr. Albright had predicted, immediately intensely intrigued by the potent combination of hidden history, familial betrayal, and powerful corporate interests. He personally flew into Oakhaven the very next day, a tall, quietly intense man with tired, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He spent an entire afternoon with Dr. Albright and me in her study, poring over Alara's original diary, cross-examining us with a gentle but relentless precision, his initial journalistic skepticism visibly transforming into a palpable, almost crusading conviction as the hours wore on. "This isn't just a local squabble, ladies," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "This has all the hallmarks of a significant national story. If what you've uncovered is verifiable, and I have a strong sense, it is then Mr. Richard Blackwood and Mr. Alistair Sterling have some very serious questions to answer." He immediately assigned a dedicated, experienced team to begin digging into Sterling Development's opaque financial records and past dealings. Simultaneously, the State Historical Preservation Office presented with Dr. Albright's impeccable, unassailable scholarly assessment, our detailed historical report, and the most compelling initial corroborating evidence from Alara's diary, including her coded references to nationally significant figures, acted with commendable, almost unprecedented speed. Within 48 hours of receiving our petition, citing the potential for extraordinary, previously undocumented historical significance and the imminent threat of irreversible damage to a potentially protected site, they issued an emergency, legally binding, albeit temporary stop-work order on any and all construction, demolition, or stabilization activities at Blackwood Manor and its surrounding grounds, pending a full on-site review. Uncle Richard was, according to Dr. Albright's now almost jubilant informant at the Oakhaven Town Hall, who had witnessed the official notice being served, positively apoplectic with a rage that turned his face the color of a ripe plum. Sterling reportedly was incandescent. The bulldozers, which had already begun to gather menacingly at Blackwood's gates, were for the moment at least silenced. We had won a crucial, precious reprieve. The first meticulously researched explosive bombshell article from Michael Davies and his team landed on the front page of the National Sunday paper just 2 days later under the provocative headline, "Hidden History, Greedy Heirs, and a Developer's Bulldozer. How a Forgotten Heroine's Legacy and a National Treasure Were Nearly Sold for Luxury Condos." The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It detailed with compelling narrative force Ilara Vance's incredible previously unknown story of courage and conviction showcased carefully chosen, deeply moving excerpts from her newly discovered letters and diary, which I had, with a mixture of pride and profound trepidation, allowed him to quote under strict conditions of respect and contextual accuracy, and highlighted Blackwood Manor's pivotal, long-forgotten role in crucial events of national history. It then, with devastating precision, began to systematically unravel the murky, deeply suspicious details of Uncle Richard's rushed, significantly undervalued deal with the notoriously predatory Ancestor Sterling, strongly, unequivocally hinting at backroom deals, undisclosed financial incentives, and serious potential conflicts of interest. The public outcry was immediate, widespread, passionate, and deafening. Historical societies from across the nation, esteemed academic institutions, prominent authors, and thousands of ordinary engaged citizens, outraged by the story, inundated the SHPO, the governor's office, and Oakhaven's local government offices with a torrent of calls, emails, and petitions, all demanding that Blackwood Manor be protected at all costs and its true history honored. The Pale Faces moment for Uncle Richard and Ancestor Sterling was not a single private cathartic event, but rather a protracted, deeply humiliating, and very public unraveling played out under the unforgiving glare of intense media scrutiny and widespread community condemnation. At an emergency nationally televised public hearing convened by a suddenly very attentive SHPO and a visibly chastened Oakhaven County Council, they were grilled relentlessly for hours by incisive, well-prepared state officials, by an implacable Michael Davies, who attended with a formidable phalanx of fellow reporters and camera crews, and most powerfully by newly emboldened, articulate local residents who felt their precious community heritage had been on the verge of being callously, irrevocably sold out from under them. Dr. Albright, calm, dignified, and radiating academic authority, presented our meticulously documented historical findings with unassailable clarity, her arguments precise, logical, and utterly devastating to Richard and Sterling's flimsy counter-narratives. Then, my heart pounding like a trapped bird against my ribs, I was called upon to speak. My voice trembled uncontrollably for the first few moments, but as I began to speak of Ilara Vance's extraordinary courage, of Blackwood's silent, waiting, precious stories, of the sacred intergenerational duty we all have to preserve and honor our collective past, I felt a profound, unexpected strength, a calm certainty flow through me. I read aloud a particularly poignant passage from Ilara's diary, her voice, her spirit seeming to fill the vast, hushed hall, silencing every rustle, every cough. Uncle Richard, seated beside a stony-faced, increasingly agitated Sterling, visibly wilted under the relentless glare of the television cameras and the palpable weight of public condemnation. He stammered, he deflected, he attempted to paint himself as a well-meaning victim of circumstance, a pragmatic businessman just trying to do what was best for the family's burdensome asset. But his credibility, already in tatters, completely disintegrated before the eyes of the nation. Sterling, a man clearly unused to public scrutiny or accountability, seeing the multi-million-dollar deal irrevocably collapsing and his own carefully polished reputation being dragged spectacularly through the mud, abruptly, angrily announced through his lawyer that his company was regrettably reevaluating its continued interest in the now controversial and economically unviable Blackwood property, effectively unceremoniously killing the sale. In the tumultuous aftermath, the State Historical Preservation Office, following an intensive, expedited, and now very publicly scrutinized review, officially triumphantly designated Blackwood Manor and its surrounding historically significant grounds as a state heritage site of exceptional national significance. The planned soulless condo development was not just dead, it was buried under an avalanche of regulatory protections and public goodwill. Uncle Richard, facing not only profound public disgrace, complete familial ostracization, even my parents, finally painfully seeing the full extent of his deceit, distanced themselves from him, but also a looming serious investigation by the State Attorney General's office into his questionable financial dealings and potential breaches of fiduciary duty related to the attempted sale retreated entirely from public life. His arrogant dreams of a quick, easy, ill-gotten fortune evaporating like morning mist before his very eyes. Ancestor Sterling, too, found his company facing uncomfortable questions and increased scrutiny on several of his other controversial development projects across the state. The sweetest, most profound victory, however, wasn't just witnessing my uncle's greedy, destructive scheme, so thoroughly thwarted satisfying as that undeniably was. It was the incredible, uplifting, almost miraculous wave of passionate public and private support that rose up seemingly from nowhere to save to heal Blackwood Manor. Donations, both large and small, poured in from across the country from ordinary citizens, moved by Ilara's story, from philanthropic foundations dedicated to heritage preservation, from historical societies inspired by our fight. The state legislature, under considerable public pressure, allocated a substantial emergency fund for Blackwood's immediate critical stabilization and its meticulous, historically accurate long-term restoration. And Maya, the once dismissed, supposedly fanciful niece, was formally, publicly, and tearfully invited by the newly established independent Blackwood Manor Preservation Trust. Its board, comprising esteemed historians like Dr. Albright, dedicated community leaders, and even a descendant of one of Ilara Vance's closest confidants, whom our research had uncovered, to serve as the lead historian, primary curatorial consultant, and a key member of the architectural restoration team for the entire multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. My dream, the one Uncle Richard had so callously, contemptuously dismissed as impractical and a childish fantasy, was not only alive and well, but was about to be realized on a scale, and with a level of national support I had never in my wildest imaginings thought possible. Today, as I walk often alone in the quiet pre-dawn light through the carefully, lovingly restored rooms of Blackwood Manor Rooms, now gradually, painstakingly being filled with period-appropriate furnishings, interactive exhibits detailing Ilara's life and times, and state-of-the-art archival facilities to house her precious writings and other related historical documents, as I meticulously supervise the cataloging of Ilara Vance's few surviving personal artifacts and prepare the narrative for our grand, eagerly anticipated public opening next spring, I often feel Ilara's courageous, intelligent, and indomitable spirit right there beside me, a comforting, inspiring presence. Her voice, once deliberately lost to the deliberate omissions and careless erosions of time, will now resonate powerfully, instructively for generations yet to come. My uncle, in his short-sighted greed, tried to bury our family's true, most noble legacy under a mountain of anonymous concrete and fleeting profit. But history, I have learned with every fiber of my being, has a powerful, enduring, and ultimately unyielding voice of its own, especially when that voice is amplified by meticulously researched truth, unwavering passion, and an unshakable collective refusal to let it be silenced or erased. The once mournful whispers from Blackwood's ancient, resilient walls are finally joyfully being heard clearly by all, and their song is one of profound resilience, astonishing courage, and a beautifully, miraculously reclaimed and now forever protected heritage. Have you ever stumbled upon a forgotten, hidden story from the past, or a precious, overlooked truth that you felt absolutely compelled, almost destined to bring into the light? What incredible lengths would you go to, or perhaps have you already gone to protect something historically precious, culturally significant, or deeply personally meaningful from being lost, ignored, or deliberately destroyed? Share your inspiring, powerful stories of preservation, discovery, and resilience in the comments section below. And please, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more compelling, in-depth tales of uncovering hidden histories, fighting for what truly deeply matters, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. Remember, our shared past is not just a static collection of dusty, forgotten artifacts and faded dates. It is the living, breathing foundation of our present and the vital, indispensable blueprint for shaping a more just, enlightened, and compassionate future. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart for joining me on this incredible, often arduous, but ultimately exhilarating journey to save Blackwood Manor and give voice to the remarkable Ilara Vance.